So just kind of as a reminder, up here on the board, we have the entire Bible listed out. And so for a reference point, we kind of talked about the book of Genesis at the very beginning. We talked about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. We talked about Noah and the flood, down to this place called Babel where the people built a tower and they got dispersed from there all over the world. We talked about a guy named Abraham, his son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob, Jacob's son Joseph, and how the people of Israel ended up enslaved in the land of Egypt. God sent Moses, this deliverer, this rescuer, to bring the people out of slavery. They conquered a land called Canaan, and a new leader named Joshua led those conquests. That began an era known as the era of the Judges. Books like Judges, Ruth, judges like Samuel, a prophet, were kind of the people in the land of Canaan. Today we're talking about this big triangle here, from Canaan up through Solomon, down to the kings and prophets to Babylon. And then the rest of the story and the rest of this semester will cover the story of Jesus and kind of the entirety, or the birth of the church in the entirety of the New Testament. And so I tell you guys all of that just to kind of give you a sense, like what we're talking about today is actually about a third of your Bible. And we're doing all of it in one lesson. And so after the people settle into the land, they want to have a king. They want to look like everybody else. They want to be ruled by one figure. And this guy named Saul is the first king. Saul's not a very good king. Eventually, Samuel the prophet anoints another king named David. A lot of you guys know stories about David. David is the one who kills Goliath. That's kind of the most famous story about him. David also wrote a lot of the Psalms. And when David became king, there's this explosion in music that's written within the country. And so they aren't just Psalms that David wrote. There's also all these other Psalms. You'll notice in Psalm 78 at the top, it says a maskil. That's the type of music that would have been playing. A maskil of Asaph. Asaph was another songwriter, so he was kind of one of the people that was crafting the music that people were singing. And why we're talking about the Psalms tonight, why we're talking about this era of the kings and prophets, is because this is an era where it was important for the older generations to tell the next generations about the things that God had done. And one of the things that I realized is, like, even as we were talking in our group, like a lot of us have parents or grandparents and people in our lives that represent other generations, but we've never asked them how their faith was shaped. Or we never asked them the kinds of things that God did in their lives. This church is really, it's like 160 years old. Like, this is a super old church. And some of the things that your parents or your grandparents even know about the ways that God has shaped this church and the way that God has used this church are really cool stories. We don't talk about them. We don't ask them. Some of your parents have had really powerful experiences of God. And as kids, we don't know them because we never ask them. I remember it took me a long time to start actually asking my parents about why we went to church and when they started going to church and what they believed and why they believed that. It's taken me even longer to ask my grandparents. And so tonight's whole kind of idea is about this passing of a story or a heritage, a tradition from one generation to the next. So go ahead and look with me at Psalm 78. This is what Asaph wrote, and this is what the people would have sung time and time again. It says this in verse 1. My people hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I'll open my mouth with a parable. I'll utter hidden things from of old. And then this is a key verse, verse 3. Things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children, so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born. And they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. They would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful to him. So did you hear in verses 3 and 4, and did you hear again in verses 6 and 7, the importance of one generation telling the next generation about God? That's how the story gets passed on. One generation experiences God, and then they share that experience with the next generation. And the next generation sees the faithfulness of God and is able to put their trust in him. It even says in verse 6, to the children yet to be born. And we've mentioned this a couple of different times throughout the semester, throughout the year, but like that right there, like that's about us. Like that's about you and me. When that was written, we were the children yet to be born. And somebody, a guy named Asaph, thought it was important to write down this song, and an entire nation thought it was important to sing this song for generations. And then later another generation came along and thought it was important to put this song in the Bible so that people like you and me would know the importance of one generation telling the story of their faith to the next generation. I want you to think about even like if you could think into the future, like even for your own kids or for your grandkids someday, like what types of things do you think you'll tell them about your parents? What types of stories do you think you'll tell them about your grandparents? What are the traditions? What are the heritage? What's the story that's going to get passed on? Ultimately, what we see in this whole middle part of the Bible is like some generations did a really good job of telling the story to the next generation, and some generations didn't. And when one generation failed to pass on that story, it's like, how many of you guys have seen like the Olympics or like a relay race? Like, there are 4 people in the relay, right? And they have a baton in their hand and they start running around the track and they reach out and they'll give some cue, and the next generation or the next person will start kind of running. And the person with the baton is supposed to pass it into the hand of the next person. And once that person feels it in their hand, they take it and they take off and they start running. Well, what happens when someone drops the baton? They typically lose the race. I mean, unless you're just crushing the competition, it's very unlikely that if the baton gets dropped, the race will be won. And what we see over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament is that the generation coming in dropped the baton, or the generation reaching back dropped the baton. And bad outcomes, terrible things happen to the nation when that happens. The same can be true in our family stories. Like if we don't get to know the stories of our ancestors, if we don't get to know the heritage and the faith heritage of our family, then we're not going to have as strong a faith in God. It said in verse 7 that we would put our trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. We would put our faith in God, not forgetting the things that he's done in the past, and building and keeping our obedience, or being more and more faithful to him in the days to come. And so to kind of end tonight, we're just going to get in one big circle here. And all I'm going to ask you are a couple of questions. I want you to think about these and then we'll answer them together. What can we do? What can you do as junior high students to learn the faith heritage of your family? That's one of the questions we're going to answer. What are some practical ways that you can go about learning the faith heritage of your family? And then secondly, how can we begin to absorb the lessons and traditions while still allowing space for our own? Because it's important as junior hires that you start to question and start to think through, is this just what my parents and grandparents have believed, or is this what I believe too? And so let's just kind of go ahead, circle up in a big circle here. We'll spend about 10 minutes or so answering those questions, and then we'll head upstairs tonight and we'll play some kickball. No, this part's just, you can just chit chat for this.